The sun over Fort Stockton did not rise gently that morning. It scorched the earth like a curse, as if the sky itself disapproved of what was about to take place. Dust hung in the air like smoke, thick with the scent of iron sweat and dread. Soldiers lined the parade ground murmurs, hushed eyes narrowed under the brims of weather-worn hats. They weren't here for a battle, but for something quieter, crueler. At the center of the spectacle stood Evelyn Blackstone. Her face was flushed from the heat, or perhaps humiliation. 25 years old, shoulders pulled stiff beneath layers of brocade and lace, she looked more like a porcelain doll left too long in the sun than the aristocrat her family name demanded her to be. Her corset bit into her ribs, the fabric of her dress clung to her skin, soaked in perspiration. She stood, without shade, without dignity, waiting. Sir Reginald Blackstone, tall and razor-thin, his silver hair unflinching in the wind, stepped forward. His voice carried with the kind of control only absolute disdain could deliver. For your gluttony, your obstinance, your continued shame to our name, Evelyn, this is your consequence. The words echoed like gunfire. Every head turned to the man beside him, a Lakota warrior known as Dakota. He stood silently carved from earth and bone, dark eyes, unreadable arms, crossed with the ease of a man who had nothing to prove. His presence alone commanded stillness. This was the man to whom Evelyn was being handed not in matrimony, not in partnership, but in punishment. "You are to go with him," Reginald said. "You will serve his people as they see fit. Perhaps among savages you will find your worth." Evelyn's lips parted in disbelief. Her voice, once sharp with opinion, failed her. Reginald turned his back before she could gather the strength to reply. He mounted his horse with the casual dismissal one might offer an old pair of shoes. Her belongings, one satchel had already been tied to Dakota's horse. She was no longer his daughter. She was an object. Exchanged, discarded. As the procession left, Evelyn's gaze clung to her father's retreating figure, trying to summon anger defiance anything other than the void that opened inside her chest. But he never looked back. Not once. Dakota motioned for her to follow. She hesitated. Not from fear of him, but from the terror of what it meant to take that first step away from everything she had ever known, even if none of it had ever embraced her. Even the fort seemed to hold its breath. And then she walked. The wilderness didn't welcome her. It consumed her. The first hours on horseback felt like days. The sun bore down relentlessly. The horizon shimmered in waves, and Dakota said nothing. Her body ached, her thighs burned from the saddle, her mouth parched beyond words. She had expected glares, perhaps leering. She had been taught these people were animals, yet Dakota never glanced her way in hunger or disdain. He offered her water with the same expression he gave the horse. He paused when she winced. He said nothing when she wept in silence the first night by the fire. There was no comfort, but there was no cruelty either. Somewhere between Fort Stockton and the horizon, Evelyn began to question what was truly savage. That night, beneath stars like cold eyes, she watched Dakota sharpen a blade beside the fire. The steady rhythm of metal against stone became a kind of lullaby. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to hate everything. But instead, she found herself staring at the calm in his face, the way the shadows danced on his skin like whispers. Why, she asked. Her voice cracked. He didn't look up. Why would you take me? I am no gift. I am no bride. He stopped sharpening, looked at her. Your father does not understand value, he said simply. Then he resumed his work. She didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because something ancient and awful inside her was beginning to crack, and through the cracks light. If this was punishment, it had not been designed for pain. It had been designed for transformation. The desert would see what the city never had. The woman beneath the weight. The soul behind the silence. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn Blackstone wasn't sure she wanted to be saved. She wanted to be seen. The days that followed blurred into one long ache. The landscape stretched on in every direction, merciless in its beauty. Red earth bled into the sky at dusk, and the stars came down like shattered glass. Evelyn was no longer dressed for courtly appearances. Her fine gown, torn at the hem and streaked with dust, clung to her like a dying skin. Her boots blistered her feet, and her soft hands, once shielded by silk gloves, were now raw and burning. Dakota never rushed her. When she stumbled, he waited. When she faltered, he shared his silence, not as judgment, but as invitation. They passed through narrow canyons where shadows clung to stone like secrets, crossed creeks, where she fell in trying to drink, and climbed hills that left her breathless. But each night they made camp, she felt less like a captive, and more like something still forming. On the fourth day, a windstorm swept down from the cliffs. Sand tore through the air like knives, and Evelyn lost sight of Dakota in the chaos. Panic clawed at her throat. She dropped to the ground, covering her face, crying out his name. Just when the fear felt unbearable, a hand grasped her wrist. It was him. He pulled her into a crevice in the rock, shielding her with his body until the storm passed. They didn't speak, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw no malice, only calm. That night, as the fire crackled, Evelyn took out a small leather-bound journal, the only item she'd saved from her mother. She showed it to Dakota. Inside were sketches of plants, notes in elegant handwriting, herbs, for fever root, for bleeding poultice, for infection. Her mother had believed in healing. Evelyn had dismissed it for years. Now she clung to it. Dakota leaned in, studying the pages. Then, unexpectedly, he pointed to a nearby bush. "That one," he said. "Good for cuts." For the first time, they shared a smile. On the sixth day, she asked where they were going. Home, he answered, just as he had once before. They passed bones bleached white by sun symbols painted on canyon walls, and strange cries in the night that stirred something ancient in her blood. Evelyn began to notice things: how Dakota walked without disturbing the earth, how he knew where to find water hidden beneath rock, how he could read the clouds like scripture. One afternoon, as they approached a rocky slope, a rattlesnake coiled suddenly beneath her feet. She froze, too stunned to scream. But before Dakota could react, Evelyn, remembering a line from her mother's journal, stomped the ground once hard. The vibration startled the snake, and it slithered away. Dakota blinked. "You listened to the land," he said. She nodded, breathless, unsure whether she had truly saved herself or been blessed by luck. But it was the first time she felt capable. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant fire. Evelyn realized they were nearing his people. Her heart ached with confusion, fear of judgment. Yes, but also something more fragile, hope. They crested a ridge, and below, nestled in the shelter of towering rock and whispering trees, was a village unlike any she had imagined. Smoke curled from huts, children ran barefoot through dusty paths, and women laughed as they worked beside one another. Dakota dismounted. He helped Evelyn down but did not guide her. "You walk in now," he said, his voice soft. "As yourself." And she did. Every step toward that village was a step away from everything she had ever believed about her worth. She was broken, bruised, and exhausted. But she had walked through the wilderness, and something inside her had survived. She had been sent into the desert to disappear. Instead, she had begun to become. The first night beneath the open sky was a war between sound and silence. Crickets chirped in an eerie, arrhythmic chorus, broken occasionally by the haunting howl of coyotes somewhere in the distance. Evelyn lay on a thin woolen blanket, staring at the void above. The stars were too close, too vast, nothing like the painted ceilings and velvet canopies of her former life. The ground was hard. Her bones ached. Her pride, once polished and sharp, now felt brittle and ridiculous in this untamed place. And yet not once did Dakota show impatience or pity. He sat a few feet away, back straight eyes scanning the darkness. His presence wasn't comforting, but it was steady, like the distant hum of the wind across the dunes. He hadn't spoken since they left Fort Stockton, nor had she. By the second day, Evelyn's boots were soaked in sweat and blood. The soles had started to tear, and the terrain showed no mercy. South Dakota's Badlands stretched out in all directions, a brutal labyrinth of spires and gullies, sun-scorched and wind-carved. Her corset, once a symbol of elegance, had become a noose, restricting her breath and bruising her ribs. When she stumbled and fell for the third time that afternoon, she stayed on the ground panting. Dakota turned back. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her. Instead, he knelt and poured water from a worn canteen into a small tin cup, setting it beside her. Then, without judgment, he waited. That moment shattered something inside her. Not from cruelty, but from the shocking realization that she had never been offered such quiet patience. Not from a servant, not from a suitor, and certainly not from her father. She drank not just from thirst, but from the strange comfort in his restraint. He wasn't rescuing her. He was inviting her to rise. The following night, a storm moved across the plains. No lightning, no thunder, just wind, and a fine dust that filled the air like smoke. Dakota led them into a shallow ravine and constructed a makeshift shelter using brush and his own body to block the worst of the wind. When Evelyn began to cough, he pulled a cloth from his pouch, dampened it with a few drops of water, and handed it to her. She stared at it for a moment before pressing it over her mouth, silently accepting that survival now depended on cooperation. On the fourth day, the land changed. The jagged rocks gave way to sagebrush and winding trails carved by elk. Evelyn began to notice things the way Dakota paused near certain shrubs, sniffing or gently brushing the leaves with his fingers. She saw him stop by a rock lifted and find a small lizard beneath which he let go again. She watched him speak to the land without words, as if every hill and stream knew his name. It wasn't the silence of a savage. It was the reverence of someone in communion with the world. That evening, as they settled near a creek, Evelyn took off her boots and dipped her blistered feet into the cool water. It stung at first, but the pain gave way to relief. Dakota was skinning a rabbit he had caught earlier, and for the first time she asked a question. "Do you always travel alone?" He looked at her. "No," he said simply. She waited for more, but none came. Still, it was a beginning. By the sixth day, she had stopped counting hours. The rhythm of walking, resting, eating, and sleeping began to feel less like punishment and more like pattern. Her steps grew steadier, her breathing deeper. She had not shed a pound, her body was still full and heavy, but she felt stronger, not smaller, just more awake. She could now keep pace without falling behind. When she spotted wild mint near a stream, remembering a lesson from her mother's old herbal journal, she picked it. That evening, she offered it to Dakota to add to the stew. He took it without a word, but nodded once approvingly. That night, something changed between them. After they ate, Dakota unwrapped a bundle from his pack. Inside was a wooden pipe carved with swirling patterns. He offered it to her. She hesitated, then accepted. The smoke was harsh, earthy, but not unpleasant. They passed it back and forth in silence. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "My brother died here," he said, his voice low. "Years ago. Soldiers. This land holds him now." Evelyn wasn't sure what to say, so she placed the pipe gently on the ground between them and whispered, "I'm sorry." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "We walk on bones," he said, "but we do not forget." It was the first story he had shared, and it rooted Evelyn in a way she hadn't anticipated. She began to understand that this journey was not just hers. Dakota carried ghosts too. On the 8th day they encountered danger. A rattlesnake coiled beneath a sun-warmed stone struck as Dakota reached down for firewood. Evelyn screamed, but he was faster. He leapt back just in time. Still, the threat remained. Without hesitation, Evelyn reached for a long branch and pinned the snake's head, while Dakota finished it with a stone. Later, as they skinned the creature and placed its meat over the fire, he looked at her with something like respect. "You moved without fear," he said. "I moved without thinking," she replied, still trembling. He allowed the corner of his mouth to lift, almost a smile. Sometimes they are the same. As dusk fell on the 9th day, the land flattened into open prairie. The wind was calmer here and the sky stretched wider. They could see the black hills rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. Evelyn realized she no longer feared the journey. She had begun to crave the ache of walking, the clarity of breath, the wordless companionship. And on the 10th day they reached the edge of a hidden valley. Below them, nestled among cottonwoods and shadowed by red cliffs, was a village. Small fires flickered like fireflies. The scent of wood smoke drifted upward. Evelyn stopped. Her breath caught not from exhaustion but from the sheer beauty of it. She looked at Dakota. His face was unreadable, but his shoulders had softened. This was home. He turned to her eyes, steady. From here, he said, "You are no longer just surviving." And then he began to walk down the path into the place where everything would change. Evelyn followed her feet, sore, her heart uncertain, but something inside her whispered, "You are not lost. You are becoming." The first sound Evelyn heard upon entering the village was laughter, clear, youthful, unguarded. It rang out from a group of children chasing each other between the small domed lodges made of hides and willow. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of where to place herself. The village, though modest, was alive with movement and order. Smoke curled from chimneys. Women stirred pots over fires, or ground maize with steady rhythm. Men, lean and watchful, returned from hunting trails carrying bows and bundles of meat. They all looked up as Dakota approached, and Evelyn felt their eyes on her. Some curious, some skeptical. None cruel. Still, her instinct was to wrap her shawl tighter to shrink into herself. But there was no place to hide in this world. Dakota did not slow as they passed through the heart of the village. He walked with silent purpose, glancing back only once to make sure she followed. At the edge of the settlement, beneath a cluster of cedar trees, stood a small structure covered in animal hides. An elderly woman emerged from it, her posture straight, despite the years her hair silver and bound in intricate braids. Her name was WíyA, and even before Dakota introduced her, Evelyn could feel her authority. She spoke to him rapidly in Lakota, her eyes darting to Evelyn, then back to him. Her voice was clipped, inquisitive. Dakota answered calmly, then gestured for Evelyn to step forward. WíyA didn't speak English, but she didn't need to. Her gaze scanned Evelyn from head to foot, not with disdain but with a frankness that startled her. Then, without a word, she turned and held the flap of the dwelling open. Evelyn stepped inside, heart pounding. The interior was dim but warm. Woven mats lined the floor. Herbs hung from the ceiling. Everything had its place. It wasn't luxurious, but it was deeply human. This, she understood, was to be her home. That night, Evelyn lay awake, listening to the village breathe. Crickets hummed. Distant voices murmured by the fires. She thought of London, of glittering salons and porcelain cups, and realized none of those places had ever felt like they were hers. Here, even in silence, she felt acknowledged, observed, perhaps even weighed but not invisible. In the days that followed, Evelyn tried to help, though her soft hands blistered, and her efforts often ended in spilled maize or crooked baskets. She learned quickly that the people here had no time for arrogance, but plenty of patience for earnestness. No one mocked her, but she saw the glances when she dropped things or hesitated too long. She began rising before dawn, hoping to practice in quiet. She mimicked the women's movements, watched how they stirred, how they wove, how they held their posture with dignity. It was WíyA who gave her her first lesson in language. One morning, she handed Evelyn a clay bowl and said, "Wojapi." Then she pointed to the berry stew within. Wojapi Evelyn repeated her accent thick. WíyA nodded and smiled not broadly, but with approval. It became a ritual. Every task came with a new word. Soon, Evelyn had names for water, fire, bowl, and wind. The language tasted strange at first, but soon began to root itself deep in her. In return, Evelyn began to teach. When she saw a group of children attempting to copy letters from a crumpled page of a newspaper, she knelt beside them and showed them how to write their names in English. She had once been taught to speak French and Latin, to recite poems and quotations at dinner parties. Now, she used that same training to draw letters in the dirt, to make stories with sticks and stones. The children adored her. They clung to her skirts, followed her from WíyA's lodge, giggling at her mispronunciations in Lakota and proudly chanting their ABCs. Evelyn laughed more than she had in years. She began to walk taller. She no longer flinched when someone looked her way. Her clothes were no longer tightly laced gowns, but simple woven fabrics that allowed her to breathe. Her hair, once piled high in elaborate styles, now hung in 2 braids, each adorned with a single bead given by one of the children. The turning point came when Lakota brought her a bundle of herbs. "This one is yarrow," he said, "good for wounds. This one is sweetgrass. You burn it when you pray." He began teaching her as his grandmother once taught him, by showing, not telling. She learned to recognize the scent of healing plants, to feel the differences in bark, to know when water was safe and when it wasn't. They said little, but their silences became companions, not barriers. One evening, after she had helped WíyA grind corn for the next day's meal, the elder woman turned to her and placed a hand over Evelyn's heart. Then, in clear, deliberate Lakota, she said, "Ska WíyA," white woman of light. It was not a name of mockery, but of recognition. WíyA smiled, and Evelyn's chest tightened. It wasn't a gift. It was an invitation. Later that week, Lakota took her to a flat plateau overlooking the village. There, under a bleeding sunset, he pointed to the stars beginning to emerge. "Every person has a name written up there," he said. "Sometimes we don't know it until someone else sees it." Evelyn looked at him. "And you think mine is written?" "I think," he said slowly, "you've always had one. You just weren't allowed to speak it." In the weeks that followed, Evelyn was no longer the outsider. She helped tend wounds, taught children, and even danced at the moon ceremony, awkward at first, but joyful by the end. She stopped trying to explain her presence. She stopped apologizing for her size, her past, her accent. She simply existed, and in doing so belonged. She began to dream in Lakota, not always clear, but fragments, faces, songs, words she had not yet learned, but somehow recognized. In one dream, her mother appeared not in a London parlor, but sitting beside WíyA, hands steeped in herbs, smiling. Evelyn awoke in tears, unsure whether from grief or healing. The village had not changed her. It had unwrapped her. The girl who arrived wrapped in silk and shame had not disappeared. She had emerged. And in the heart of the wilderness, beneath foreign stars and unfamiliar names, Evelyn Blackstone, now Ska WíyA, had begun to understand what it meant to be truly seen. Not as decoration, not as burden, but as a presence, a person, a voice in the song of a living people, The first signs of intrusion came with the scent of tobacco that didn't belong. Sharp, processed unlike the sweetgrass Evelyn had come to associate with prayer. Dakota noticed it before she did. His head lifted suddenly one morning as they were preparing food with Wanya. A frown crossed his face, quiet, unreadable, but firm. By nightfall, a scout returned with confirmation white men soldiers, 12 riders. Among them a man in a velvet coat and polished boots. Sir Reginald Blackstone had returned. Evelyn froze when she heard his name. For a moment, she felt her old self rise like smoke from a fire not quite out. The shame, the tightness in her chest, the bruises invisible beneath lace. But she was not that girl anymore. She pressed her palms to the earth, grounding herself in the dust she had learned to walk through. When she looked up, Dakota was watching her. "He comes for you," he said. "But you do not have to go." The village council gathered that evening, lit by the warm orange glow of firelight. Elder voices spoke in Lakota, slow and deliberate. Evelyn, now fluent enough to follow, listened as they debated whether to flee or stand. The winter grounds were waiting distant and cold, but some felt the risk was too great. Soldiers were unpredictable. Others, especially the younger men, bristled at the thought of retreat. Dakota stood at last. His voice was calm but carried weight. "This fight is not ours," he said. "It belongs to him and to her." Evelyn felt the weight of that truth. This was not a story of armies or tribes. It was the final reckoning between a father's cruelty and a daughter's rising voice. Dakota walked with her that night away from the firelight toward a narrow canyon marked by stone carvings older than memory. "I want to show you something," he said. They hiked in silence until they reached a ledge. There, carved into the cliff wall, were images of buffalo of moons, of women standing with open arms. "This is where my people come to speak to those who came before," he said. "It is where I was brought as a boy when I lost my brother. My grandmother brought me here to remind me I was not alone." He reached into a pouch and handed her a stone, smooth and round, painted with a single white mark. "We all carry weight," he said. "But not all weight is a burden. Some becomes part of our strength." Evelyn closed her fingers around it. "And what if I'm not strong enough?" Dakota looked at her not with pity but certainty. "You already are." The next day the soldiers came. Dust rose like ghosts behind their horses. The village stood still, quiet, waiting. Evelyn stood beside Dakota, her braid now woven with a single blue feather, a gift from one of the children. She wore a simple dress stitched by the women she had worked beside for months. No corset, no lace, just truth. Sir Reginald dismounted with practiced arrogance. He looked older, gaunter, but his eyes still burned with the same cruel control she remembered. "Evelyn," he called out, "thank God, we've come to bring you home." She stepped forward slowly. "This is my home." His eyes narrowed. "Don't be ridiculous. You've been taken in by savages. Look at you, dressed like a servant, living in squalor. Whatever charm they've used on you will undo it." Dakota stepped beside her, his presence calm but firm. "She stays or goes by her will, not yours, not mine." Reginald's face flushed. "You gave her to this man," the lieutenant beside him asked, confused. "As punishment," Reginald snapped. "Not as a gift. Punishment." Evelyn echoed her voice, shaking with anger. "That's all I've ever been to you. A shame to be hidden. A price to be paid, but I'm not yours anymore. I never truly was." Reginald took a step forward. "You are unwell, clearly not in your right mind. A man in Boston has offered his hand wealthy generous. He'll overlook your flaws." Evelyn felt Dakota's hand brush hers, just slightly, not claiming her, but anchoring her. "I am not a flaw," she said, "and I am not for sale." The tension thickened like a storm about to break. The soldiers shifted uneasily. The lieutenant raised his hand, signaling retreat, but Reginald exploded. "If I can't take you back, then no one will have you." He reached beneath his coat and drew a pistol. The sound of the shot cracked the stillness. Everything blurred. A young warrior lunged, taking the bullet to the shoulder. The village erupted. Women rushed to pull children back. The soldiers raised their weapons, caught between duty and confusion. Old Dakota's voice cut through the chaos. No more blood. The warriors froze. The lieutenant stepped forward, furious. "Your man fired without cause," he said to Reginald. "You're under arrest." Reginald raged, but the soldiers bound his hands and pulled him toward their horses. The lieutenant turned to Evelyn. "Do you want to come with us?" She didn't hesitate. "No, I'm home." That night, Evelyn sat beside the injured warrior, pressing poultices of yarrow and sweetgrass into his wound. He didn't flinch. She worked in silence, the firelight dancing on her hands, now rough but sure. The blood didn't frighten her. She had seen worse inside herself. Dakota joined her once the boy was stable. "You chose," he said. She nodded. Not against him. For me. They sat quietly, letting the night settle around them. The danger had passed, but the moment would echo for years. In choosing to stay, Evelyn had not merely defied her father. She had claimed herself. And in the valley of red cliffs and wind-carved stone, she finally understood freedom was not given. It was declared, not with weapons, but with voice, with truth, and with the courage to say, "This is who I am, and I belong." Spring arrived in the valley not with grandeur, but with quiet insistence. Snowmelt fed the hidden streams. Wildflowers pushed stubbornly through dry earth. Life, as it always did, returned. And with it came a rhythm Evelyn had come to know deep in her bones. The kind that wasn't taught but absorbed through dirt under fingernails, through songs sung around fires, through days lived with purpose instead of pretense. It had been nearly a year since she first stepped onto this land as a discarded daughter. Evelyn Blackstone, once spoken with derision, now barely remembered. To the people of the village, she was Ska WíyA, and Ska WíyA belonged. She woke with the sun, her body strong, now still full. Still curved in ways society had once shamed, but capable. Her arms carried water, lifted baskets, cradled crying children. Her legs walked miles through woods and grasslands without complaint. Her hands, once adorned with lace gloves, were now tools of healing. She had become the village's midwife and herbalist, a role passed to her by Wanya, with a quiet nod and a bundle of sage. The children no longer stared at her awed or confused. They ran to her knowing she had berries in her pouch, or songs to share, or a cooling salve for sunburned shoulders. She had taught many to read in the mornings, and learned their legends in the evenings. Some of the girls had begun weaving beads into their hair the way Evelyn did bright colors in careful patterns. It made her smile, because she had never imagined being anyone's example. Dakota, now her partner, not just in survival but in life, remained steady as stone beside her. They had no need for a wedding in the eyes of the world, no vows spoken beneath stained glass. Their commitment was sealed in gesture, and seasons passed side by side in the trust between them that deepened each day. During the winter solstice, the elders had offered their blessing, and the village danced until the stars melted into dawn. Evelyn remembered the warmth of Dakota's hand on hers that night, not as ownership, but as balance, not as rescue, but as recognition. They had no children of their own, though not for lack of trying. The ache of that loss had once been sharp, but it softened over time, soothed by the love they gave and received freely. Every child in the village called them auntie and uncle. Every scraped knee, every frightened mother, every young girl with questions about her changing body, Evelyn was there. She gave without condition, and the people gave back in kind. News of her story eventually traveled beyond the valley. It reached as far as Boston, where a woman named Margaret Fulton arrived with a journalist's curiosity and a cautious respect. She came not to gawk, but to listen. Evelyn welcomed her. Over tea, steeped with wild mint, she shared the parts of the story that mattered not the spectacle of a noblewoman lost to the wild, but the truth of a woman finally found. Margaret's articles sparked whispers, then conversations, then slow shifts in the way some Easterners viewed the Lakota and other indigenous peoples. Evelyn didn't care for fame, but she did care for understanding. And if her journey helped soften a single hardened heart, it was worth retelling. When Wanya passed, it was Evelyn who bathed her body in sacred herbs, who led the women in the morning songs. She wept not just for a mentor lost, but for a lineage she had come to protect. The role of healer and keeper of wisdom passed to her without ceremony, only the quiet understanding of the village. One summer, a group of settlers from a nearby town sent word asking to join the harvest celebration. In the past, such gestures were met with skepticism. But Evelyn advocated for the invitation. She stood before the council, her voice firm. "We don't have to open everything, just the door. Let them see who we are, not who they've been told we are." The celebration was a cautious, beautiful mingling. Music carried across languages. A young white girl stood beside a Lakota boy as Evelyn taught them both a circle dance. Women from both communities shared stories, traded bread recipes, and beadwork patterns. A wall had cracked, and in its place, Evelyn saw something resembling future. Years turned like river stones, smoothing sharp memories into lessons. Evelyn often returned to the ledge above the valley where Dakota had once shown her the petroglyphs. It was their place now. A journal sat in her lap, pages filled with notes on herbs, sketches of flowers, phrases in both Lakota and English. She was writing it for the next woman. Not to follow her footsteps, but to find her own. Dakota's hair had silvered with time, but his hands were as steady as the first time he handed her water without judgment. He still carved flutes in the evenings and still played them when words failed. Sometimes they sat in silence for hours, watching the sky shift. It was enough. One night, under the full moon, he asked her softly, "Do you ever regret it? Staying here with me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, worn, scarred, and warm. "No," she whispered. "Not for a single moment. My father thought he was sending me into exile. But he gave me the greatest gift. He let me walk away from a world that never saw me, and into one where I could finally see myself." Dakota nodded, his eyes glinting with understanding. "You came here broken," he said. "But you were never weak. You were just waiting for your name to find you." Ska WíyA smiled, her heart full. She had spent years ashamed of her size, her voice, her desires. Now all of it had become her strength. Her softness had become healing. Her fullness had become presence. Her voice had become legacy. And as the stars climbed the sky, the woman she had become stood steady, not in defiance but in belonging. Not in resistance but in rootedness. And her story, once meant to be a cautionary tale, had become a torch for others, lit not by perfection, but by the courage to begin again. It began with smoke. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a cooking fire carried by the wind. But then came the scent, bitter, acrid, wrong. Evelyn was gathering yarrow and purple coneflower on the eastern ridge when she turned toward the village and saw the plume rising black into the sky. She dropped her satchel and ran. By the time she reached the village edge, chaos had taken root. Flames licked the side of one of the dwellings. Children screamed. Women threw water from clay pots, and men shouted for order. Dakota was already there, directing people away from the danger, his voice sharp but steady. Evelyn's heart pounded in her ears, not just from the sprint, but from the memory of a nightmare she had once had of being surrounded by fire, and unable to protect anything that mattered. She rushed to Wíya's old shelter now, the place where she kept her herbs and medicines. Inside, flames had begun to crawl along the rafters. She didn't think. She pulled her shawl over her mouth and plunged into the smoke. The heat was immediate and savage. She coughed, tears stinging her eyes as she fumbled for the bundles of dried medicine, wild ginger, arnica, elderflower. She knew it was foolish. They could be replaced. She couldn't. But these weren't just herbs. They were knowledge, history, pieces of Wíya's voice still alive. Lakota appeared in the doorway just as the roof groaned. "Ska WíyA!" he roared, barreling in through the smoke. His arms wrapped around her, yanking her backward, even as she struggled. "Let it go," he shouted. They emerged into the air just as the roof collapsed behind them in a hiss of sparks. Evelyn fell to her knees, coughing, her hand still clutching a charred satchel with only half of what she'd hoped to save. Later, they discovered the fire hadn't been an accident. A settler's cart parked nearby with an open lantern had tipped over. The man, young, fearful, and ill-prepared, had panicked and fled. Rumors swirled. Some believed it was a targeted act, others that it was ignorance. The council was divided. Anger rippled through the village, especially among the youth. For the first time in many seasons, Evelyn saw fear in the elders' eyes, not just of fire, but of fracture. That night, the village sat in heavy silence. Evelyn's hands were blistered, wrapped in cloth, soaked in calendula. She sat beside Lakota, her face streaked with soot and uncertainty. "I thought I had rebuilt everything," she whispered. "But it's all so fragile." He placed a hand on hers. "It isn't about what burns, it's about what we choose to rebuild. But rebuilding would not be easy this time. Some families spoke of leaving, of moving farther west, of protecting what remained before it was taken. Even Evelyn's own students, the girls who once copied English letters and played clapping games, looked at her now with questions she couldn't easily answer. It was in this uncertainty that Margaret Fulton returned unannounced. She had heard of the fire through letters and brought a photographer with her, eager to document the aftermath. She was kind, careful in her words, but Evelyn felt something shift. The camera lens felt like a threat. Not because it judged, but because it preserved. "Tell me what you want people to know," Margaret asked, gently setting down her notebook. Evelyn hesitated. "That we are more than one moment," she said finally. "That what you see today, ashes, fear, that's not all we are. But it is part of it." That night, under the full moon, Evelyn stood before the village with her hands still wrapped, her voice raw. "We have lost something sacred," she said. "But not everything sacred is built from wood and smoke. What we carry inside us that cannot be burned unless we let it." She called on the children to join her the next day to help her begin again. Together they rebuilt the medicine lodge. It was smaller, simpler, but into its walls they wove feathers, drawings, and notes from memory, an archive not just of plants, but of people. And something else changed. A settler woman whose husband had once traded with the village brought a gift, a book of native plant remedies she had found in her grandmother's attic. "I don't know if it's useful," she said, "but I thought maybe it could be part of what you're doing." Evelyn opened it with trembling fingers. Notes, pressed flowers, annotations in looping script. Tears welled in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "it's useful." The medicine lodge became more than a place to heal wounds. It became a place to teach, to grieve, to grow. And for the first time, settlers and Lakota sat together on woven mats, sharing stories, not from behind fences, but beside fire. Evelyn looked around one evening at the circle gathered before her. Children, elders, visitors, family. A woman once discarded had become a keeper of something deeper than survival. She was a keeper of bridge work. Her scars remained. Physical, emotional. but she wore them with the same pride as the beads woven into her braid. Not decorations, declarations. As firelight flickered across her face, she told one last story for the night. Not of herself, but of a woman long ago who walked across fire and emerged with medicine in her hands. "My name is Ska WíyA," she ended, "and I am not who I was. I am who I chose to become." If you followed this far, if Evelyn's journey stirred something in you, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Support helps us continue bringing untold stories of the Wild West, stories of transformation, courage, and redemption. And trust me, the next one might be even wilder.